If Africa is so risky, why is your phone working? Why do you have batteries? Why are you eating chocolate and hot chocolate and cookies and ice cream? The reason that Africa gets labeled high risk isn't Africa, is that most of the intelligence being applied to these markets is built without accounting for the most important variable. That variable is the knowledge systems that have been embedded in these economies that actually function. Traditional knowledge systems are the most underleveraged asset category in African markets right now. Africa is risky, yet we still have phones in abundance, chocolate in abundance, shea butter in our skincare, all from Sephora and Olive Young. Yet, the cobalt in the battery in our electronics mostly come from the DRC. The cocoa in our chocolate, hot chocolate, cookies, ice cream, that is mostly also coming from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Shea butter, that's West Africa. So somebody has to be pulling enormous value out of the continent of Africa every single day for us to have these products in abundance. Yet the countries that grow cocoa import most of their chocolate. Where cobalt is coming from, they import most of their batteries. Crude oil, they're importing their gasoline. So the question has never been whether Africa is poor or whether there's value there. The question is who actually understands what's making the cycle work, the value chain work. Because it's not usually the people that you think. And that gap, the gap between who holds the knowledge and who's capturing the value, that's what this show is about. If you're building in Africa, you might be sourcing ingredients, you might be evaluating investments, perhaps you already have an investment portfolio and you're thinking about entering a new part of the market, this show's for you. If you are in the diaspora, and what I mean by that is you have certain cultural advantages by your family, you might have family on the ground, the cultural knowledge that is cultural IP, and you're still trying to figure out how to turn that into something concrete, this show is also for you. And if you're looking at Africa, you've been observing and seeing all of the, I would say, misunderstood, complex, dynamic news on the economic stories happening right now, and you think it's surface level info, or you're not getting the actual reality of what's happening on ground from that $50,000 report, this show is also for you. So what is this show not about? This show is not a cheerleading for Africa show. It's not an Africa Rising show. Kumbaya, let's get excited. It's also not doom and gloom. Most of that is already established everywhere you look. This show is trying to specifically understand how things are actually working. Where is all that value going? And not from a fair trade perspective. When we talk about shea butter in your lip balm or the cocoa in the hot chocolate, what's actually driving the economic behavior in these markets? Because the answer to that last question is almost never what the analysis says. I'm Freda Idoko. This is Coming to Africa. Let's get into it. Let's start with something I think gets misdiagnosed constantly. When people try to explain why Africa is hard to invest in or hard to build in, bad information, unreliable data, unpredictable infrastructure, and some of that is true. I think the problem is deeper. And the deeper problem usually typically doesn't get talked about enough. And it's not usually the bad information, it's that the frameworks through which people are entering or building in the market, those frameworks are for different markets. They are, in essence, structurally blind to how things actually work in Africa. So let me show you what I mean. McKinsey in 2010 brought out this report that was called The Lions on the Move. This was in 2010, like I said. And it essentially projected that four sectors in Africa in 10 years, so by 2020, would have generated about 2.6 trillion US dollars. And out of that report came a lot of investment decisions that drove the Africa Rising investment movement, if you will call it that. And by 2016, McKinsey had to walk back or in other words, acknowledged that the growth that they projected had slowed down by 3.3%, which was highly off the mark. But I'm not trying to pick on McKesson here specifically, not in this case, because they're not uniquely wrong in this situation. The point is that the strategies that they used assumed certain things. And the things that they assumed were formal market structures, institutional stability, patterns of consumption that reflected the same patterns in the US, the UK, and the Western world. And usually, when you have wrong assumptions, they break, right? Your projections fail. Things fall apart. And not because Africa underperformed, it's because the analysis that was used already had bad measurements from the get. Now, here's what I think it was missing. I think the most important drivers of economic behavior in these markets will not be found in reports or spreadsheets. They're going to be in the knowledge systems that have been operating on the ground for centuries. And these knowledge systems, most Western frameworks have no category for. Let me give you another example. If you fast forward to 2023, there was a flurry of articles telling us how about 15 African startups had lost over $200 million in a single year. And these were not small operators, and these were not rookie mistakes. I'll give you two examples. One of the companies was called Grow Intelligence. It was an agro market intelligence company. They had raised $85 million. And they had the Gates Foundation and Unilever as clients. They shut down. You have another company called 54 Gene. They're a genomics focused African genetic data company. They had also raised about $45 million between the Gates Foundation and Y Combinator. They also shuttered. Now, here's what I want you to pay attention to. These weren't bad ideas. The agro market intelligence, that was intelligence for African food systems. That's something we desperately need here. 54 Gene, that was building the largest African genomic database in the world. These underlying problems need to be solved, and they're real problems. So why does this keep happening? And it happened across 15 different companies. I think the explanation that I keep coming back to is that it wasn't the capital. It was not that the people weren't qualified. These were highly credentialed teams, but that they were still using these frameworks that I keep talking about that are built for Western markets. The way that they defined traction, the way they defined what adoption looks like, or market viability, all entirely on formal economy. What does adoption look like in a market where 65% of the market is activities informal? What does trust look like when the financial system runs on rotating savings groups that are highly informal and have been operated that way for 5 centuries? And what does distribution look like, for example, for a successful media industry on the continent that was built with market traders and oral agreements? So these aren't rhetorical questions. They're not rhetorical questions at all. I want you to take them really seriously because they're actual questions. And if you're not asking them, you're not seeing the real asset. Like, what is actually of value here? Before we go any further, there's something that I really want to land with you. The reason that Africa gets labeled high risk isn't Africa, is that most of the intelligence being applied to these markets was built without accounting for the most important variable. That variable is the knowledge systems that have been embedded in these economies that actually function. Let's use M-Pesa. M-Pesa is a multi-billion-dollar company, and it was built on something called the Chama network. And the Chama network is a savings architecture that is structured around rotating across a group of people. And it made the adoption of M-Pesa instant because it matched the trust structure that already existed within it. Now, nobody priced for that. Nobody put that in a model. The gap between what the asset is actually worth and what it's currently priced at, that is what this show is going to keep coming back to. But first, let me tell you why I see this a little bit different than a lot of people. I spent about 15 years building go-to-market strategies for some of the largest companies in the world: Confluent, Kraft Heinz, McKesson. So if you think about it, these are big tech, big consumer, big pharma. These are companies with serious global ambitions. And in the 15 years, across every single global go to market plan that I worked on, sub Saharan Africa was structurally absent. And not because the opportunity wasn't there. I think it's mostly because nobody had done the work of taking what was actually working and happening on the ground and turning that into something that a boardroom could act on. So in 15 years, I've seen that gap continue to widen. And when I see capital go in without knowledge infrastructure to support it, the results are usually predictable. They crash and they burn. Watching traditional knowledge also get extracted without the people who are holding this knowledge see any value of the upside is usually why we see most of the headlines we see. That is my strong belief. Now, eventually, I was forced to spend a protracted period of time in Nigeria last year. And I looked around and couldn't make sense of what I was seeing because it did not jive with the headlines and what I wanted to believe desperately. And so I decided that I'm going to build in Africa for the next decade. So you see, right now, I myself am here trying to make sense of what's actually driving economic activity on the ground. That's why I'm here. That is what this show is for. So I've essentially told you what the problem is, that we have the wrong lens being applied to the real assets in this economic space. Now I want to show you what these assets actually look like. When I say traditional knowledge systems, that sounds abstract. But when I say traditional knowledge systems are the most underleveraged asset category in African markets right now, I really mean that. I mean that as a precise commercial claim. Here are three examples, each in a different sector, each with a different country, maybe, but they show the exact same pattern. That knowledge has been running through these markets for centuries, and it's this knowledge that's been quietly driving the enormous economic outcomes that we're seeing. The chocolate in your grocery store or that lip balm, like almost entirely invisible to conventional analysis. I'm going to start with talking about M-Pesa. So now M-Pesa is, I would claim, the most successful mobile money system in history. And by 2014, it had reached 97% of Kenyan households. In 2006, only about a quarter of Kenyans had any form of financial access at all. So in under a decade, 26% to nearly universal, right? That is significant growth. And the standard story is that Vodafone had this great idea and it worked. That story is missing a very important part of it, the structure of M-Pesa. And so when Vodafone and Safaricom, these are the telecom companies that designed or worked on designing the system, they specifically partnered with this local organization called FAULU. I might be butchering this, but FAULU Kenya. And why would they do that, right? These are big companies. They've done this elsewhere. This was because FAULU Kenya's customers were organized in what we call chamas. Remember chamas? I talked about that earlier. So to give you more precise detail on what chamas are, a chama is a rotating savings group. What does a rotating savings group mean? It means that you and your 10 friends each put in a fixed amount of money every month. And every month, a different person from that group of 10 friends or 11 friends gets the whole pot. So if 10 people each put in $100, one person gets $1,000. Then the next month, a different person gets it. You rotate through until everyone has received a lump sum. So this is how you create access to meaningful capital when there are no banks willing to lend to you. And it's very different from the microfinance model. And it works because it's trust between 10 individuals who know each other. Specifically, this is the kind of trust that builds over years inside of a community, not the kind that gets verified by credit scores. So this system has been operating in East Africa for centuries. There's versions of it across other parts of Africa as well. So in Nigeria, they call it the Esusu, and it's been running over 500 years, right? And in South Africa, it's called the Stokvis. Now, South Africans, don't come for me if I butcher the pronunciation, But right now, there are over 800,000 active stockbay groups, right? And M-Pesa didn't succeed because it introduced a new financial behavior. It just built on the local knowledge system, the local behavior that was already working. It succeeded because it digitized a financial behavior that already existed and that, more importantly, that people trusted completely. Now, M-Pesa is worth tens of billions of dollars, 9.8 to be exact. The platform has about 70 million people. The Chama network it was built on, that trust net architecture, the behavior infrastructure, the proof of concept that had been running for centuries, nobody has ever put a valuation on that. This is the invisible layer, and it's invisible to most investment analysis. But it's also the whole reason the product worked. Now, ask yourself, if you're building fintech in Africa and you don't know that, what are you actually building? Now, let's move on to a different example. We're talking about Nollywood. This is the Nigerian film industry. And for those who don't know, it's the second largest film industry in the world by volume. So they generate somewhere over 2,500 movies a year. And in Nigeria, it's also the second largest employer after agriculture. The question you should be asking yourself is, how in the world was this built? It wasn't through venture capital. There's no formal distribution contracts, not through any infrastructure that a business school would tell you need, but it was through something very important. And that thing is called the Alaba International Market in Lagos. This is where you have traders, you had oral agreements, cash transactions. These are what people would call guild structures that had evolved over decades. And they handled trust, quality, dispute resolution, and control. Everything a formal contract system would handle without a single piece of paper. Now, there was a researcher called Ramon Lobato, I believe, and he spent years studying how Nollywood actually functions, and his conclusion is worth noting. He said there's compelling evidence that informal markets can create efficient, economically sustainable media industries. What looks chaotic from the outside is a highly functional system that evolves specifically for the conditions it operates in. That statement is truly important. You have to build specifically for conditions on the ground. Nollywood built a $6.4 billion industry without reliable electricity, without a formal distribution infrastructure, without institutional funding. And so if you're a streaming company or a media company or a content distributor thinking about Africa, and your first question is, how do we build distribution infrastructure here? I can tell you that's the wrong question. I believe you should be trying to understand what distribution infrastructure already exists, because something has existed here. It's been running for decades. The question is whether you understand how it works. And of course, this deserves further conversation, especially on Netflix, because I think there's some failure stories that is worth a whole other episode. But we can talk about M-Pesa in the same way. This is the same lesson all over the place. The system was already there. There was knowledge that built it and sustained it. That's the asset. And it's invisible to anyone using any Western framework on the continent. Now, I want to go over a third example. This one, same pattern, but a little bit darker because it's sort of related to the pharma industry. This is where you see what happens when the knowledge gets seen, but it's misunderstood, right? When the asset gets extracted without people who built it seeing any value or any of the upside. And we're talking about Hoodia. If you don't know what Hoodia is, it's a succulent plant that grows in the Kalahari Desert. And the San people, who are probably the most studied indigenous ethnic group on earth, they're an indigenous community in Southern Africa. And they have used this succulent as an appetite suppressant for thousands of years. Thousands of years. When they go on lung hunts and there's no food available, they chew on Hoodia so they don't feel hungry. This is like nature's free GLP-1 for these guys. Let's first of all say that that's pretty practical and effective, and it's definitely ancient knowledge there. But in 1995, a South African research institute patented the active molecule in Hoodia. They licensed it to a British company, and Pfizer acquired the development rights. And if you want to know what the potential market was, it was around £6 billion. So here's the detail that for one, I can't get past. At one point during the legal dispute that followed, there was a spokesperson for Pfizer who described the Sand people as extinct. They were trying to patent knowledge from this community that they claimed no longer existed. The Sand people, like very much alive. And the Sand people themselves, they found out through a newspaper article. And granted, they eventually got royalty agreements in 2002 after threatening some legal action. Now, there's another plant called Graphonia simplicifolia, and it's a plant that grows in West Africa. The seeds contain one of the highest concentrations of a compound called 5-HTP, and 5-HTP is a serotonin precursor that's usually put in supplements for people sell at the gym, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar global market. Now, Ghana has exported over 5,000 metric tons of Graphonia seeds in over 9 years, and they have zero commercial scale extraction of 5-HTP in Ghana. They ship it out as raw seeds, and it gets processed in China, India, and gets put in capsules. When it gets to North America, Europe, $40 a bottle. The seeds, that's where all the value lives, right? Raw seeds. And here's the thing that I want you to sit with. This isn't just an ethical fair trade problem. It's an intelligence problem. The knowledge of what these plants actually do, how to work with them, how to grow them, how to source them at scale. That knowledge exists in these communities, and it's been there for generations. These people came in, extracted the value, and didn't really understand that piece. They just saw the molecule. Now, understanding the full picture, who holds knowledge, how the supply chain actually works at the origin, what fair entry looks like, that's the difference between extraction and opportunity. So everything I've walked you through, the Chama network, the Chama architecture, the Nollywood distribution system, and the botanical knowledge sitting across different communities on the continent, this has been true for a very long time. The asset has always been there. What's changed is the stakes. So right now, 3 things are happening that are making this knowledge gap more expensive than it's ever been. Number 1, capital is arriving without understanding. If we take, for example, the Gulf sovereign funds, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. Those 3 countries have invested over $113 billion in Africa alone. And they did this in 2022 and 2023 alone. And that's more than the previous decade combined. So why are they investing so much in Africa? That's because the Gulf states import over 85% or at least 85% of their food. And they have enormous capital, but almost no agricultural land. Africa has the opposite problem, enormous agricultural capacity and capital deficit. So it's a structural match. It's a trade that makes sense, right? So the capital is moving and it's moving fast. The Saudi agricultural investment and livestock investment company also acquired about 80% of a company called Olam Agri. They acquired it for about $78 billion. Olam Agri operates in over 30 plus countries on the continent. So here's where there's some tension, right? The capital is being deployed faster than there is intelligence infrastructure to support it. What do I mean by that? When people make agreements like this, there's certain questions that need to be answered before the money is in. Like, who are we going to partner with? How are the community dynamics going to change when access is granted? What the knowledge systems look like on the ground? Those questions aren't happening before the money comes in. They're being answered after. So this is not a critique of the investors. It's just a description of the gap that exists. And every time I speak of a gap, it's an invitation. It's an opportunity. So it's the same gap that costs those 15 startup companies we talked about over $200 million, but it's just at a different scale. Now, the second thing driving the increase in the knowledge cost of the knowledge gap is the minerals race, right? The minerals race is a knowledge problem. And when we talk about the minerals in Africa, we can't deny the fact that Africa has a significant amount of minerals. We're talking about 70 to 78% of the world cobalt, 80% of the global platinum group of metals, and a significant portion of lithium, which is used in our EV transition for vehicles, right? So on the one hand, China controls approximately 87% of the global mineral processing. What that means is when the mineral comes out of the ground in Africa, it has to go through a process of transformation to make it into something that the battery manufacturer can use. Right now, that happens in China. But the US is also trying to get into this business, right? Or get into the processing market. And in February 2026, they signed about 11 bilateral mineral agreements with different African countries in a single month. And it was worth roughly $30 billion. And I mention this just because it's the same pattern, right? The capital is ready. There's a knowledge gap and it's a bottleneck because just signing the deal doesn't necessarily mean that we've answered those questions about who's going to be partnered with, what part of the local knowledge is going to be leveraged, and what happens to the community when access is granted. How much of the value gets distributed back to the knowledge that has been holding this for centuries, right? The third is a legal framework. Now, the legalities around extraction has changed. In 2024, WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization, they passed the first international legal framework requiring that companies need to disclose where their generic resources come from and which community provided the associated traditional knowledge. This is the first time this has ever been passed, and it happened just 2 years ago, which means that for decades, you could walk into almost any community, file a patent, and you never have to tell anyone where the idea came from. This has happened. I can give you numerous examples, but this has been commonplace. The Hoodia story I told you about earlier, that happened under a system where no disclosure was required, right? And what happened to Griffonia in Ghana is still happening today. It started under a system where there was no disclosure required. So that's changing now. And so this does mean that every pharmaceutical company, every cosmetics company, every food manufacturer that has ever sourced a biological ingredient from this continent now has a compliance question that requires that they have exactly the kind of intelligence that has not been systematically built before. And the window where this knowledge could be extracted without consequence is closing. So the window where understanding creates genuine competition and advantage, that's opening. So again, let me rephrase that. The window where the knowledge could be extracted without consequence is closing. And the window that's opening is the window where understanding creates genuine competitive advantage. With that being said, let me try and put this all together for you guys. If Africa is so risky, why is your phone working? Why do you have batteries? Why are you eating chocolate and hot chocolate and cookies and ice cream? The value was never in question. What's been in question for decades across billions of dollars of capital deployed by the most sophisticated investors in the world is who actually understands what's making it work. So the Chama network that made M-Pesa the most successful mobile money system in history, it was invisible to investment analysis. The distribution architecture that built a $6 billion film industry, also invisible. That botanical knowledge that built a multi-dollar supplement company, extracted, not understood. So the most underleveraged asset class in these markets is not undiscovered. It's just been looked at through a slightly inaccurate lens. So that's what this show is going to be about. Like I said before, every episode we're going to go into one value chain, one sector, and one country. And we're going to try to go where the knowledge is moving and most people aren't looking. I'm Freda Idoko. This is Coming to Africa. If this landed with you, share it with your friends, share it with one person who you know is trying to build something real in these markets. And that's genuinely the best thing you can do for the show right now. is the first episode, and we're going to be building much more. Talk soon.